further deeper into this, but from a very high level, what are the Pandora Papers and what do they show? Rob, we'll start with you first.
Well, it's a massive dump of documents. It's almost 12 million documents dumped to the international consortium, which works with journalists around the world. No individual media organization could possibly, as you can imagine, handle something like that. So this is a sort of methodology where they bring in partners around the world. We each take a slice, focus typically on our own countries, and we go through it. So we don't know the source. We have absolutely no idea who the whistleblower is who provided these documents, as has been the case in the past. But they effectively detail corporate registrations and offshore tax havens. So they detail records from 14 different offshore providers, as they're called, which are accountants, law firms, facilitators who allow typically wealthy clients to move money offshore through shell companies, through offshore corporate registrations. And to some extent, they also go beyond that, in some cases, to tell us sort of the motivations, the thinking behind these things. So there's email correspondence, there's memos, there's bank statements, there's indications of movement of specific money or shares between trusts and corporations. And so it's a massive, obviously, task to go through all of this and then to triangulate and piece together the documents that all can move into a paper flow that allows you to track something over time. And it's a tremendous amount of work and anxiety and stress, as you can imagine. But at the end of the day, it's also tantalizing in the sense that these are records from places and systems and legal structures that are designed to not be seen and have not been seen before now. And so we are effectively gazing into what are intensely secretive documents that show movement of money that has an inherent public interest.
I mean, this is exactly what the point of these things is people always say, well, is it illegal? Is it legal? Is it illegal? We can debate that, on and on and on. And there is a giant debate on it. But what's important from a public interest point of view, from a journalistic point of view, is that there is an entire shadow economy of trillions of dollars that go around the world all the time and that people have no idea. Nobody knows. The government doesn't know. Tax officials don't know where these trillions come from and where these trillions go. And so these leaks, following from the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers and now the Pandora Papers, are really pulling back the curtain on this huge economy around the world that is going on and that is completely designed to never be seen until now.
So let's try and quantify this a bit. Marco, what is the cost of this kind of tax evasion?
So on the top level here, Canada actually has started calculating this cost. This is something that other countries have been doing for years, but only in the last 3-4 years has Canada now put out reports where they pour over the numbers and they're able to actually quantify how much money we, the public, lose to tax havens every year. And it's somewhere in the range of about $15 billion a year. Right? It's an absolutely astronomical cost, and that's just for Canada. If you add up all around the world, it's trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars every year that disappear out of tax coffers. And of course, that's money that could be used for teachers or hospitals or long-term care homes or public health measures. There are lots of things that we could be spending this money on instead of just parking it in offshore accounts.
So Rob, let's talk about some of these revelations. What do these papers show about the money that's hidden around the world?
So there's the typical list of high-profile political figures, public figures, celebrities, etc. And then there's also some really interesting, previously unknown names that struck us in Canadian. And so we sort of did a broad look at those who inhabit the offshore world. And so what they show is a whole range of things, and it's really interesting because the motivations in each case are different. The details of how it's done are different. And so it's a lot of forensic work trying to figure out how this all works. So some of the names that have been in the press as of yesterday are, the King of Jordan, who we did a deep dive on. So this is related to the cache of luxury homes across the world, from California to Washington to London, that he's been purchasing over the last number of years through shell companies, facilitated by a wealth manager, a Brit, but who started his career in Saskatchewan, $26,000 job. Fascinating kind of career trajectory from a low-level accountant in Saskatchewan in the 80s to the royal court in Jordan, assisting the king and fiercely protecting the king's identity in these transactions. In this case, the motivation was absolutely not tax evasion. The king does not pay taxes in Jordan. So this was not a case of attempting to hide transactions as a result of seeking to avoid taxes. There's a number of theories on it. The king himself, in response to us, said it was for privacy reasons. He feared terrorist threats. The addresses or locations of these homes were to be made public. The experts we talked to had different theories. Among them, the scandal and public outrage that would follow from information about the king making these lavish purchases at a time when this country is going through utter economic turmoil, protests in the streets over corruption, protests around tax evasion in that country. Meanwhile, hundreds of millions of dollars coming in from the West in aid to that country while these transactions are taking place in, oceanside mansions in Malibu. So one can imagine that might have focused the mind in an effort to obscure those transactions and ensure that his name is not on those. We also looked at Canadians. We featured in this story in today's newspaper some Canadians ranging from Lawrence Stroll, who many of your listeners may have seen in the current Netflix series on F1. So he owns an F1 team. He's a fashion mogul, made his money in fashion. He appears amongst the star-studded lineup of billionaires in an offshore company. We feature
one of the people you profiled as being part of this is an owner of MindGeek, which is the Montreal-based parent of Pornhub, which is a company that has come under a great deal of scrutiny recently. Who is he, and what did you find out about his dealings?
It's David Tassilo. So he's become fairly prominent in the last little while. He actually appeared before a parliamentary committee several months ago investigating allegations of profiteering through publication of essentially illicit videos of people engaged in non-consensual sexual acts. He's part of the executives of that company who are named in a massive class action lawsuit in the United States. 34 women filed a class action lawsuit alleging that their images, without their knowledge and against their will, has been on Pornhub and other websites. And so we covered that story not long ago, and then in the course of doing this work, digging into this data, he appears as the sole director of 4 companies offshore, Anguilla, British Virgin Islands, and 2 in Delaware, which is sort of considered a domestic tax haven in the United States. And in each of those cases, what was interesting to us is that because we could see the actual registration, the corporate registration documents, effectively a receipt of services that he received from the company that sets up these corporations on his behalf, he actually paid for what are called nominee shareholders and directors. So these are people that essentially take a small fee to put their name on corporations offshore in order to ensure that the actual owner, the beneficial owner, the true owner is not anywhere named. And so it's an extra degree of security and secrecy for which he paid. And of course, that made it interesting for us. And we posed that question, never did really get an answer as to why. First, he went offshore, and secondly, he chose to mask his own name and identity on these corporations. But it's a theme that runs throughout these documents and previous leaks. This function, which is entirely legal, which allows effectively you or I to set up a corporation offshore, which we own, for which we are the sole owners or directors, but our names never appear. And so, this goes back to sort of this question, is it legal or not legal? Well, maybe the real question to be asked is it right? Is it moral? Is it ethical?
We'll be right back. I think, we should tackle this right now. And I think one of the examples might be able to spell that out a little bit. Someone listening to this right now is probably thinking, why should I care about this? I mean, if I ever became ultra rich, I'd probably want to hide some of my money in some of these things. And I think that maybe, Marco, you can handle this. Elvis Stoico was interesting. I think that's a name obviously that'll come up to some people. And he seemed to be entangled in one of these, right?
Well, that's right. I mean, so here's the really interesting part, right? It is very tempting to paint with a broad brushstroke, but, we should point out Elvis Stoico, Olympian, extremely famous, accomplished Canadian figure skater. Because of the rules at the Olympics, amateur athletes aren't actually allowed to make a lot of money, right? And so Skate Canada sets up trust funds for the athletes. And it's a way of saying, look, when you get some prize money, we'll stick it in this trust, and then it's not yours technically, so you can stay under the bar and you can still remain an amateur athlete. And so Skate Canada does this for everybody, and it's seen as legitimate. When you stop being an amateur, then you can get this money later. But what did Elvis Stoico do? He sort of took it a step further. He took his Skate Canada trust money and he moved it to an offshore trust in Belize where it's no longer declarable and it becomes secret. And again, it's hidden and it's offshore. And there are all sorts of questions about why someone who very publicly won this money would want to take the money offshore. And so again, it comes down to the secrecy aspect. You know, there are many people who would argue that it is totally legitimate to make, any kind of arrangement that you want to make to optimize your taxes. Like if you can stick some money in a TFSA or an RESP and lower your taxes, go for it. And then I guess the question then becomes, well, sure, but you have to put your name on it and you have to tell the CRA you're doing it if you're going to reduce your taxes in a legitimate way. But when you move stuff offshore, it disappears. It goes into the ether. It's gone. It's no longer attached to you. And there's all sorts of crazy rules around technically what your lawyer says you have to tell the Canadian government you're doing and not. And so in this particular case, it's very unclear as to whether Elvis Stoico told the CRA whether he had all this money offshore or not, or even whether he had to.
You guys, in your reporting, have basically said that Canada has really become a laggard in dealing with this. Can we talk a little bit about that and maybe some of the things that might be possibly done to fix this?
The number one thing Rob and I have been reporting on this since 2016, since the Panama Papers. And the number one thing that comes up time and time again is just put your name on it. Put your name on it will solve a lot of problems. And so what does that mean? That means when you start a company or a trust or a limited partnership or whatever kind of sort of bizarre, arcane business structure you want to set up, onshore or off, just put your name on it. The vast majority of the problems of the offshore world would be solved if we just required people to put their names on things. If you buy a house in Toronto, you got to put your name on it. If you buy a condo in Toronto, you got to put your name on it. If you open an RESP, you got to put your name on it. But as we've seen in the Panama Papers and in the Pandora Papers, you can open up an offshore company in the BVI, pay someone there $100 a year to put their name on it, and then you've got plausible deniability. You say, that isn't my company. I don't know what you're talking about. Those billions don't belong to me. And so this is the reform that we see all over the world. And it really started even pre-Panama Papers, where the UK set up what they call a beneficial ownership registry. And it's anyone can go online, type in the name of a company, and bang, you know who owns it. And this is seen not only from a tax point of view, this is seen just from a business point of view. You want to know who you're doing business with. If you're about to sign a contract with a company, you can look it up and say, oh, that company is legitimately owned by Rob Cribb. This guy is not trying to scam me or whatever. And so this idea of making an open registry so everyone can look up every company in the world and make sure they know who's behind it has slowly but surely been working its way around the world. It now exists in the EU. It now exists in the US. In BC, they set it up for property only, so that now you can't register a property to a company. You got to put your name on it. And Quebec just passed legislation to make all their companies, you have to put your real ownership on the companies. And so, Canada is we're years and years behind. Get this, in most tax havens in the world, you actually have to put your name on it now legally, but in Canada, you don't. So if you register a company in the Caymans, you got to put your name on it. It's not public, but somewhere in some government office, your name is on that company. In Canada, no, you can pay someone else to put their name on it.
And to that point, the reason that you now have to at least register your name in offshore tax havens like this is because of the journalism, right? It was the Panama Papers and sequence of leaks that ultimately pushed this issue forward to the point where there was legislative response. There was such public outrage globally and internationally. World figures could no longer hide behind it. It was on the radar for the first time, and that has slowly made things better in these offshore jurisdictions. Comparatively, in Canada, we still lag, right? So if you look at just the sheer numbers since the Panama Papers, which was 2016, right? So it's a good sort of period of time to judge the reaction and enforcement response to this thing. So around the world, billions of dollars have been recovered by tax agencies, hundreds of investigations. In Canada, not one. Not one prosecution. As far as we can tell from the CRA, we don't know if there's a single dollar that's been recovered. This is frustrating. And it's not because, Trudeau hasn't put money in. He did respond. They put lots of money into hiring auditors, etc. But the enforcement mechanisms in place in this country, perhaps the legal systems, there is likely a constellation of factors. You just cannot seem to go for big fish, get them into court, lay charges, and prosecute.
Guys, I'm sure there's more to come, but let's journalism nerd out a bit. This is being called the largest collaborative journalism project in history. Let's talk about that. Tell me more about how that worked.
Yeah, so it was 600 reporters, I think is the last number, which is inconceivable. Imagine trying to get 600 reporters to work on something for 8 months without even leaking it. It's always a miracle to me that these things happen without any word sort of getting out. So we're placed under very strict secrecy. We work through encrypted communications, and there is a very fiercely protected code among those involved. And everyone has, abided by it. So we all communicate through this sort of centralized online forum. Everything that we find, we're obligated to share, and vice versa. If we find a journalist at Le Monde in France or The Guardian is working on something similar, there's a sharing of information. In some cases, we actually actively collaborate. One example in this particular story, this King of Jordan story, one of the main characters was this British accountant, this facilitator, who we were very interested in because of his Canadian background. And we couldn't get him to respond to our questions on email. So ultimately, it was a Swiss reporter who knocked on his door in Switzerland, where he lives, and ultimately put questions to him. He still didn't answer, but nevertheless, we got confirmation from him that he was aware of the allegations that we were about to publish, and he chose not to respond to them.
I mean, I almost want to say it's such a miracle that this thing works. I mean, I can't emphasize enough to listeners how this goes against every journalistic bone in your body, right? Your instinct is you find something good, you want to hold on to it and keep it for yourself, get that scoop. And, in a world where dwindling resources in media are widespread, every media organization struggling financially around the world, this kind of collaboration is almost breathed new life into, and it's a total change of the way we operate. It used to be, this cutthroat competition, get something and hold it back until you get it all and then blow away the competition. And here we are, chatting in French with the reporters at Le Monde and speaking to guys in Japan and Jordan and all across the Middle East and coordinating, and it brings this richness to the reporting that we could never have done on our own because you get that real local perspective. If you have a question about something that's going on in Jordan, the reporter in Jordan will tell you, oh, no, let me explain to you. This is how things work over here. And so we just get this ability to kind of be on the ground in places that we're not on the ground. And that adds a level of sophistication and local context that we could never have done on our own.
Gentlemen, it's a fascinating story. I'm sure it will have incredible ramifications, and we will be following along. I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Raji.
Robert Cribb and Marco Oved are investigative reporters at The Star. On a final note, the following people were discussed in this episode and when reached for comment, provided these statements. David Tessio wrote a statement saying that the offshore structure The Star asked about was, quote, the first and only I've ever set up on behalf of MindGeek, and the transactions and structure were entirely appropriate. Elvis Stoico told the CBC, a Pandora Papers partner, he set up a trust on the advice of his longtime lawyer and that it was closed in 2012. Lawrence Stroll's personal financial advisor, Jonathan Dudman, responded to The Star saying that Superwit Profits was a small business originated by Stroll's friend, David Tang, in 1998. And the King of Jordan's lawyers, in written correspondence, said there is nothing improper in the King's ownership of properties through offshore companies and that he has not misused public money or aid. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Raju Mundar. Our This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachneck, Slava Etizaz, and Sean Pattenden. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Patton. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribing matters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.
All right, now, in what is being described as the biggest reveal so far, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists have published the most expansive expose of financial secrecy. The documents leaked as part of the Pandora Papers have now sent shockwaves of embarrassment through global circles of power. The leak has now uncovered a lot of wealth, ill-gotten wealth in some cases, that is being stashed away in places where these individuals don't necessarily have to pay tax and they can resort to money laundering. Belonging to hundreds of politicians and billionaires, the expose is based on 11.9 million documents that have been obtained with the help of more than 600 journalists and about 150 news outlets over 2 years of reporting. The leak has also found links between almost 1,000 companies in offshore havens and 336 high-level politicians and public officials, including more than a dozen serving heads of states and governments. So let's take a look at some of the key revelations that have emerged in the Pandora Papers so far. The files show Jordan's King Abdullah II reportedly created a network of offshore companies and tax havens to amass nearly about a property worth $100 million between the years 2003 till 2017. This includes 15 homes from Malibu, California to Washington and London. Jordan's king has faced angry protests against austerity measures in recent years. Another
Okay, another extraordinarily significant and wildly underreported story here from the media. Stephen Donziger, you guys know, we interviewed him last week about the way that Chevron has persecuted him. For those of you who don't know the context of the story, he's a human rights lawyer. He won an unprecedented settlement against Chevron for their crimes against indigenous people in Ecuador. Chevron has not paid a single penny of the billion-dollar fine that was levied against them for poisoning and destroying this whole area, and people got cancer, people died. It was a total crime and atrocity. They haven't paid a single penny. Instead, their strategy has been to make an example out of Stephen Donziger, the successful lawyer who actually had a chance of holding them to account. And sad to say, they have been entirely successful in doing that. Stephen has been locked in his house for more than 2 years on home confinement, wearing an ankle bracelet like some great global criminal for the crime, allegedly, of being held in contempt of court for not turning over his laptop that he did not want to turn over during discovery to protect his attorney-client privilege. So they got a corrupt judge who totally railroaded him. He's found guilty on this charge, a charge that he reminded us when we interviewed him last week, the day before his sentencing, no lawyer has ever spent a single day in prison for, okay? No one has ever spent a single day in prison.
In U.S. history.
In U.S. So this man's been locked in his home for 2 years. Sentencing happened last week on October 1st, and they sentenced him to 6 months in prison. And when I saw that news, I thought, okay, well, surely, when I first spoke, I thought, well, surely they must have credited him for time served for these 2 years that he's been locked in his home. Stephen Donziger, you guys know, we interviewed him last week about...
Okay. Oh.
Another extraordinarily significant and wildly underreported story here from the media. Stephen Donziger, you guys know, we interviewed him last week about the way that Chevron has persecuted him. For those of you who don't know the context of the story, he's a human rights lawyer. He won an unprecedented settlement against Chevron for their crimes against indigenous people in Ecuador. Chevron has not paid a single penny of the $1 billion fine that was levied against them for poisoning and destroying this whole area, and people got cancer, people died. It was a total crime and atrocity. They haven't paid a single penny. Instead, their strategy has been to make an example out of Stephen Donziger, a successful lawyer who actually had a chance of holding them to account. And sad to say, they have been entirely successful in doing that. Stephen has been locked in his house for more than 2 years on home confinement, wearing an ankle bracelet like some great global criminal for the crime, allegedly, of being held in contempt of court for not turning over his laptop that he did not want to turn over during discovery to protect his attorney-client privilege. So they got a corrupt judge who totally railroaded him. He's found guilty on this charge, a charge that he reminded us when we interviewed him last week, the day before his sentencing, no lawyer has ever spent a single day in prison before, okay? No one has ever spent a single day in prison.
In U.S. history.
In U.S. So this man's been locked in his home for 2 years. Sentencing happened last week on October 1st, and they sentenced him to 6 months in prison. Now, when I saw that news, I thought, okay, well, surely, when it first broke, I thought, well, surely they must have credited him for time served for these 2 years that he's been locked in his home. Nope. They did not credit him whatsoever. The judge went on some insane rant about him. The whole thing has been a total corporate prosecution. The Southern District of New York, they refused to prosecute him.
Yes.
The UN has come out and ruled that this is an illegal prosecution, that not only should he be released immediately, but that we should be paying him reparations for what we have done to this man. And instead, now he's spending 6 months in federal prison. For all the media people who pretended during the Trump years that they were so worried about creeping authoritarianism, about the end of our democracy, you don't care about this total corporate takeover of our judicial system? Tell me when you see a single cable news segment about this absolutely outrageous, atrocious crime that has been committed against this man, and that is meant to send a message to all whistleblowers, to anyone who would hold the powerful to account. And it is outrageous and shocking and saddening that Chevron has gotten their way here, and they have made that example on Stephen Donziger that they want to do.
Well, what's crazy, too, about the case, to people understand, is the people who prosecuted him was actually a private law firm that the judge brought in order to prosecute him. That law firm also has Chevron as a client. And so effectively, they're being paid to privately prosecute by the very people that have a judgment. At the very least, it's a conflict of interest. I also asked him, I was like, how do you go to prison without facing a jury? And it's contempt charges, which are less than 6 months in time, that is at the sole discretion at the judge. Now, look, on appeal and all this, is this all going to hold up? I have no idea. But by that time, he'll probably be out of prison.
Yeah.
And at this point, the man's been in his house in downtown Manhattan for like 2 years. And now is going to be in federal lockup for 6 months, which is pretty crazy. And again, even if he was guilty of sin, which, he disputes, whatever. I don't actually know the general facts on the contempt charge itself. Even if he was guilty, probably shouldn't still go to prison.
This is
given
a
the facts
misdemeanor
of the facts of the case. It's a It's a first misdemeanor.
I think they call it a Class C misdemeanor. It's the
Class C
lowest
misdemeanor?
possible criminal charge.
Right,
You have.
lowest possible criminal charge, 6 months in prison, not facing a jury, being sentenced by a judge who had brought in the private prosecutors. All of this, I would say, is just complete nonsense. And it's like you said, if people are really worried about the appearance of corruption with our judicial system, which, by the way, we brought you recently that story about 131 judges who forgot to recuse themselves from cases where they had a direct financial interest, a direct Wall Street Journal investigation
found that where sometimes judges had hundreds of thousands of dollars in assets in the very companies they were delivering rulings on. Oh, and those rulings actually almost always broke in the favor of those companies, and therefore the judges' assets.
2/3 of the time, Soccer. Let's be fair.
Sorry, yeah, 1/3. Overwhelming. I'm just saying, coin flip, and you would have seen a little bit of a different thing. Random probability would tell you that it probably should be 50-50 whenever it comes to a real review. So, look, I would put this all together and say this is absolutely outrageous. And yeah, I don't think it's a surprise that we're the only ones really covering it. A few people, the media. I just saw a tweet actually from David Sirota, Punchbowl News, which we actually use some of their reporting sometimes because they have good congressional
Inside
reporting.
the Beltway,
Yeah, well, their newsletter this morning was presented by Chevron. Their news this morning presented by Chevron. Am I saying that it's a cover-up? No, but like, look, when people want to cover stuff or tweet something, you got to think about it. It's going to screw me whenever it comes to advertisers. There's a reason we fund our business the way that we do. So we don't have to have any sort of implication whatsoever. But Chevron and the people who they hire as ad people, those people control a whole lot of money whenever it comes to media buys and advertising. Is that part of the factor? I think we'd be lying if we said it wasn't.
Of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, Politico Playbook, which is like the insider journal newsletter, last week brought to you by Pharma. Brought to you by Pharma.
During the whole
While their,
negotiation, right.
Medicare negotiation prices and other relevant healthcare policies are being debated, and the DC insider newsletter is being brought to you by Pharma. Yeah, it is atrocious. And by the way, the Biden administration, they haven't said a word, all their concern about, democracy and judicial system. Just imagine if it was Trump going after this guy.
Oh, yeah.
Just imagine the wall-to-wall coverage.
Yes.
But I think that's it. It's because you don't have, first of all, they don't really care about corruption, number one. Second of all, you don't have this blue-red horse race dynamic that they can sink their teeth into. And so, they don't, when it comes down to it, they don't really give a shit. All they're concerned about press fairness, Julian Assange, we see what nonsense that is. All their concerns about authoritarianism and the future sanctity of our democracy, they don't really care. This is a crime. It's an absolute outrage. Stephen Donziger should be freed immediately. He never should have been confined in the first place. And the fact that this is getting so little attention and that the media doesn't care about it is a crime in and of itself.
Yeah, that's right.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut. Our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions. All that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.
It's the biggest ever leak of offshore data. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists has published the most expansive expose of financial secrecy. Almost 12 million documents, 11.9 to be precise, obtained with the help of more than 600 journalists and 150 news outlets over 2 years of reporting. The Pandora Papers, as they're known, have sent shockwaves of embarrassment through global circles of power.
No. No. That's weird. No,
line.
Nope.
Crystal, what are you taking a look at today?
Well, guys, Kirsten Sinema is the literal worst. This, in my mind, is a nonpartisan statement of fact. She's the worst because she blatantly does the bidding of the donor class. She is the worst because she shamelessly postures for her post-Senate career of cashing in. She's the worst because she ran on a slate of popular issues, things like prescription drug reform that she just casually abandoned once Big Pharma asked her to. You need more proof? Well, here she is, suddenly dropping her support for Medicare negotiating prescription drug pricing in exchange for hundreds of thousands of dollars in positive ads from Big Pharma. Great work, Daily Post, you there. Here she is meeting with the very corporate interests that could profit off of killing the reconciliation bill as she blatantly goes out and does their bidding. Here she is, leaving DC in the middle of critical negotiations so that she can go meet with her big dollar donors at a high-end resort and spa in Phoenix. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all just within the past 2 weeks. When you look at the long trajectory of her career, you can see an even grosser transformation from principled anti-war activist to brazen corporate sellout. It's all so blatant as to be one of the most shameless displays of corruption I have seen in DC, and that is a really high bar. But somehow, many in the press refuse to see it that way, where anyone with 2 working brain cells could see a bought-off politician playing the donor class. Somehow they see a brave trailblazer setting an independent course. Somehow it never occurs to them that while that course might be independent of what voters want, it is in lockstep with what her donor class wants. But perhaps the most grotesque part of all of their recent glowing portraits of Kirsten Sinema is their insistence that all of her personal attributes and quirky character traits are somehow more important than the fact that she is casually denying people affordable prescription drugs and a livable wage. Here is just a sampling of some of the worst of that coverage over just the past few days. So Axios, they want you to know, Kirsten Sinema's allies have some free advice for anyone trying to bully the wine-drinking triathlete into supporting Biden's $3.5 trillion budget bill. She doesn't play by Washington's rules, and she's prepared to walk away. She doesn't play by Washington's rules? Since when do Washington's rules not include doing whatever your corporate handlers tell you to do? That is literally the rule of Washington. The accompanying article goes out of its way to mention Sinema's eccentric dress or sexual orientation and has quite a lot of detail about her exercise habits as well. Listen to this line and try not to puke. She's unconventional. See recent internship at a Sonoma winery and a force to be reckoned with. She's known to rise between 4 and 5 a.m. to train for her next race, and she was forced to take aqua jogging after breaking her foot this summer in something called the Light at the End of the Tunnel Marathon. Friends, I do not give a single fart about what time Kirsten Sinema wakes up in the morning. I care that the sum total of her waking hours seem to be spent taking bags of cash in exchange for making the country worse. There's another line from that same piece. Progressives could be forgiven for presuming that Sinema, 45, the first openly bisexual member of Congress, who's easy to spot in her trademark sleeveless dresses, wry wigs, and acrylic glasses, would share their woke politics. Guys, wanting old people to be able to afford their drugs and go to the dentist is not woke politics. But I don't want to pick on just Axios here, even though there's a lot to get into. There's so much more. CNN's Michael Smerconish wants you to know Washington needs more Kirsten Sinemas to stand in the way of the most obvious and popular reforms. Please listen.
But Manchin and Sinema are deserving of our praise, not our criticism. Their refusal to simply fall in line and instead exhibit some independence is both a rarity in Washington and a reflection of their diverse constituencies. Consider that Sinema's Arizona constituents pretty evenly divide between R's and D's and I's.
For the 1 millionth time, Kirsten Sinema is not responding to the political preferences of her constituents. As Matt Iglesias pointed out recently, Sinema is literally posing the most popular elements of her own party's agenda. She opposes raising taxes on the wealthy and corporations, as we've demonstrated here. Repeatedly taxing the rich is extremely popular in a bipartisan way. But to make matters even worse, she instead floated a carbon tax, which would be wildly unpopular and also would fall on working class people. And of course, the prescription drug pricing reform that she has decided to oppose after being bought up by pharma has like 80% support. It is literally the top priority of the American people. There's a recent poll that listed all of the priorities of the reconciliation plan, and more Americans said that prescription drug pricing reform was their top priority than anything else in the entire plan. It is insanely popular. So no, Michael Smerconish, Kirsten Sinema is not responding to diverse constituencies. She is responding to one constituency, and that would be the donor class. Last but not least, Maureen Dowd penned a real doozy here. The headline reads, Sinema stars in her own film. In it, Dowd writes, the Arizona senator's name is pronounced Sinema, and it is apt because she sweeps and sometimes, when the triathlete has a sports injury, limps through the Senate like a silent film star, the Greta Garbo of Congress, as one top Democrat called her. Let me be perfectly clear. There is nothing enigmatic or mysterious about Kirsten Sinema. She is a very old and very predictable type in Washington. The corporate sellout, shilling for the donor class. Her only new twist on that old type is to use her identity as a shield for her pernicious and destructive agenda. And apparently, plenty establishment media types have been blinded by this type of terminal, late-stage identity politics. Or more likely, they're happy to weaponize it for a corporate agenda in the same way that Kirsten Sinema herself does. Like now I'm supposed to be persuaded to overlook your terrible politics, not just because you're bisexual, but also because you drink wine? What? Sure, she'll keep you and your kids in unrelenting poverty, but she works out a lot, so that's what really counts here, people. Slay queen, but like literally, because your policies are killing people. And Tucker, it is unbelievable to watch the way. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut. Our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions. All that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.
There are many well-worn narratives around immigration and the immigrant experience. What is far less discussed is the reverse, repatriation, or even just the desire to reconnect with the land left behind. It's a powerful draw for many, as writer Kamal Al-Solali explores in his latest book. It's called Return, Why We Go Back to Where We Come From. He's also the director of the School of Journalism, Writing and Media at the University of British Columbia, and he joins us now from Vancouver. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Joel.
All right, so I'm going to start with this. In your book, you admit talking about death and burials is sort of a conversation killer. Yet that's where I want to start, because that's where you start in your book. You ask the question, where do you want to be buried? Can you explain sort of the circumstances behind that question?
Yes, of course. I was in Toronto at the time, and my partner at the time and I were walking alongside Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Midtown Toronto. I'm sure it's a place that a number of your viewers are familiar with. And the question came up, and my partner asked that question, and my answer was very direct. Toronto. Why would I want to be buried anywhere else? And the sort of part of the impulse of the book comes from the fact that that conversation was in 2012, and when I started writing the book in around 2018, a lot has changed around the world, in Ontario, in Toronto, that made me kind of, in a way, pause and reflect and take back what I said, and wonder if I really want my remains to be in Toronto, because this is where you choose to be buried is probably the most, or the ultimate connection to the homeland, the ultimate manifestation of your thinking and desire about what is home to you.
Now, you were born in Yemen, raised in Egypt and Lebanon, educated in England, and now you live in Canada, Vancouver. Which of these countries? We do not have an accurate number. There is disagreement about the number of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people in Canada. And in a world where data drives decision-making, one Indigenous group is highlighting the importance of accurate documentation for what has become a human rights crisis in the country relating to MMIW G2+ people. It's very important because then how do you know what kind of policies or programs you need to put in place, how much training you need to do, and where you need to do that training? How did this even happen in the first place, that there's undocumented cases? Lynn Groom, CEO for the Native Women's Association of Canada, says to solve a crisis, one needs to determine how big the crisis is, and she believes Canada doesn't have a clear picture when it comes to MMIW G2+ issues, in part because of underreporting from Indigenous people to police due to historical distrust with law enforcement.
What?
In 2014,
Are you
RCMP
serious?
released a report that showed more than 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women documented between 1980 and 2012, but Groom says that number is far too low. Well, we think that the number is much higher. We think it's closer, could be between 4,000 and 6,000.
Every day is a struggle, and how do you keep going, right? And, it's the other families that are going to be impacted that, you want to stop that from happening. And we all have a responsibility as society to do something.
Bernadette Smith has spent the last 13 years looking for her sister Claudette Osborne, who vanished in 2008, only weeks after giving birth to her baby girl. Smith says it isn't lost on her as an Indigenous woman in Canada that she is 4 times more likely to leave her house and never be seen again when compared to a non-Indigenous person.
Society needs to shift and start treating, people as equals and not looking at race or gender or socioeconomic status.
Our women, who are the backbone of our society to look after our children, are the ones who are under attack.
SCO Grand Chief Jerry Daniels says collecting data is important, which is why his organization conducted a survey into the calls for justice as part of the national inquiry into MMIW G2+ people to help provide clarity for governments and Canadians about this issue and how to respond to it. The survey shows 80% of respondents are either a family member or friend of an MMIW G2+ individual.
Many of us, our family members, are subject to this. We're on the receiving end of a system that is not designed to protect us. In fact, I would say that it's designed to keep us in poverty. And yes, our women become sort of victims of that system. That's why it is how it is right now.
In Winnipeg, Mark Neufeld, City News.
It's Mr. Legault's to lose. He's going to win the next election, provided he doesn't do anything ridiculously silly in the last 12 months.
After 3 years of power and a pandemic, Premier François Legault is a year away from the next provincial election. His party, the CAQ, is still in the lead with 47% of support, according to a recent Léger Journal de Montréal poll. With an ambitious agenda, Legault's government is being urged to recognize systemic racism in its institutions after the coroner's reports into the death of Joyce Echaquan recommended they do so, amid criticism that Quebec didn't make September 30th, National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a public holiday for what Legault called reasons of productivity and saying it would be too expensive.
He has an approach of like a parental approach, like you don't deserve this day. It's kind of like, I don't think he's aware of what's really going on with Indigenous people at this point, because this day is not deserved. it's actually owned to us. We've lived intergenerational trauma.
On Monday, Legault admitting he lacked sensitivity in a Facebook post saying the government didn't send the message of compassion and solidarity with the Indigenous community, and he takes responsibility for it.
Wow. So belittling to somebody who suffered so much. So I don't think I would accept this apology. No, I think you have to say it. And if you really wanted to do something concrete, you would actually put a holiday into this.
It's a bit of a stain that Mr. Legault is going to have to deal with, because while one may or may not agree with him that Quebecers are not more racist than anybody else, there needs to be affirmative gestures made to say this is what we do to stem any kind of racism.
Despite 65% of the 1,002 people surveyed by Leger being satisfied with the CAQ, many are still calling out Legault to stop saying systemic racism doesn't exist in the province.
It means that he doesn't recognize you as a person. He doesn't recognize your brother, your sister.
Essentially in denial, which is just it ruins our reputation as citizens of Quebec, and it gives us a bad rep, which we already have. So, as far as I'm concerned, he needs to be voted out.
I really don't think that he represents the young people of the province of Quebec.
This is a society problem, not me. And if we go and say that there is a society problem, we can move forward.
Legault's priority for the political year ahead seemed to be an economic recovery with a plan to unveil a mini budget and language reform with Bill 96.
That resonates with his base, the base that put him there and the base that continues to support him, including a significant portion of the PQ base now believes he's actually an actual better leader.
Voting day for the next provincial government in Quebec is set for October 3rd, 2022. In Montreal, Alicia Rubertucci, City News.
People belittling to somebody who suffered so much. So I don't accept this apology. No, I think you have to say it. And if you really wanted to do something concrete, you would actually put a holiday into this.
It's a bit of a stain that Mr. Legault is going to have to deal with, because while one may or may not agree with him that Quebecers are not more racist than anybody else, there needs to be affirmative gestures made to say this is what we do to stem any kind of racism.
Despite 65% of the 1,002 people surveyed by Leger being satisfied with the CAQ, many are still calling out Legault to stop saying systemic racism doesn't exist in the province.
It means that he doesn't recognize you as a person. He doesn't recognize your brother, your sister.
Essentially in denial, which is just it ruins our reputation as citizens of Quebec, and it gives us a bad rep, which we already have. So, as far as I'm concerned, he needs to be voted out.
I really don't think that he represents the young people of the province of Quebec.
This is a society problem, not me. And if we go and say that there is a society problem, we can move forward.
Legault's priority for the political year ahead seemed to be an economic recovery with a plan to unveil a mini budget and language reform with Bill 96.
That resonates with his base, the base that put him there and the base that continues to support him, including a significant portion of the
Facebook is back in the news, and once again for not the right reasons. The world's biggest social media company is facing a bunch of accusations, and the information supporting the allegations comes from its own internal documents, such as their findings on how Instagram is harming the mental health of teenagers. In fact, the social network has been slammed by US senators for the same. One of them even said, and I quote, IG stands for Instagram, but it also stands for Instagreed. What are the other allegations, and how is the tech giant retaliating? Watch a report to find out.
Facebook has earned a bad reputation, especially on fronts related to data privacy and security. And the latest controversies have opened a new can of worms. According to documents reported by the Wall Street Journal, Facebook has had different content sharing rules for many celebrities, politicians, and other high-profile users. In other words, for certain elite users, Facebook's rules don't seem to apply. This happens under a system known as cross-check, an internal program that is ostensibly meant to double-check enforcement actions against certain users. While posts from users flagged for X-Check are supposed to be reviewed by better trained moderators, in reality, it is being used to let these high-profile users break the rules that would have gotten most people into trouble. According to the report, just 10% of posts that hit X-Check actually get reviewed. Until 2020, the program reportedly protected 5.8 million people. Users protected by the program include former U.S. President Donald Trump Jr., United States Senator Elizabeth Warren, and others. These users are usually unaware that they're being given special treatment. Now, Facebook's own oversight board, which has been appointed to make decisions on tricky content moderation, has demanded more transparency. The board may have a discussion with Facebook on this matter and make some recommendations, although Facebook is not bound to follow them. In another set of allegations, Facebook is said to be not so serious about certain important and sensitive issues. The documents reported by the Wall Street Journal suggest Facebook employees regularly flag information about drug cartels and human traffickers on the platform, but the company's response is weak. Facebook has a defense for this, too. The company cites its comprehensive strategy to keep people safe, including global teams with native speakers covering over 50 languages, educational resources, and partnerships with local experts and third-party fact-checkers. Critics, however, warn that Facebook does not have the potential and resources to moderate all the content on its platform and protect users. Not just the users, Facebook's own shareholders seem to be disappointed with the company. They have filed a lawsuit against the tech giant. They allege that board members overpaid on a $5 billion Federal Trade Commission fine to resolve the Cambridge Analytica data scandal. They believe it was done to protect CEO Mark Zuckerberg from an individual lawsuit. Facebook is in a deep mess, and perhaps the company is in a need of an image makeover. But the way it has been going around trying to achieve this is unethical. According to a New York Times report, Facebook had started an initiative to dump pro-Facebook content into people's news feeds. Why? In order to boost its image and try to paint the company in a positive light. This is said to be a part of Project Amplify that was introduced as a PR exercise. Facebook, however, says that there have been no changes to its news feed ranking system. Facebook is also being accused of hiding critical data about Instagram, a company that it bought in 2012. The world's largest social network was aware that the use of the photo-sharing app by some teenage girls led to mental health issues and anxiety, and it chose to keep it secret. Here are some of the findings from Facebook's own internal research, which has been leaked. Instagram made body image issues worse for 1 in 3 teen girls who were surveyed. Teens blamed the app for increasing anxiety and depression across groups. Around 13% of British and 6% of American teen users who were part of the study reported suicidal thoughts and linked them to Instagram. Facebook's latest fiasco has drawn strong criticism from lawmakers, drawing on the internal research leaked by a whistleblower at Facebook. U.S. senators grilled the company on its plans to better protect young users on its apps. This is how they slammed the social network. It is powerful, gripping, riveting evidence that Facebook knows of the harmful effects of its site on children, and that it has concealed those facts and findings. IG stands for Instagram, but it also stands for Instagreed. You cherry-picked part of the research that you think helps your spin right now. To deflect criticism, Facebook has paused the development of a kids' version of Instagram geared toward children under 13. But is it enough? Facebook has more than 2.8 billion monthly active users. Instagram has about 1 billion. Facebook needs to sustain their trust. And this utter lack of transparency about its own policies and findings is not helping the cause.
Everywhere. And I think he's probably relieved to no longer have to sit as the MLA.
Former Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister announced Monday afternoon that he is resigning as MLA for Fort White, effective immediately. The news comes after Pallister stepped down as party leader and as Manitoba's premier on September 1st. In a statement, Pallister says it was his honor to serve Manitobans over the past 9 years. Quote, I leave my seat in the Legislative Assembly excited to see Manitoba on the eve of having our first woman as premier. I'm confident that they will continue to represent the principles and values of our party and seize the opportunity to lead our province in post-pandemic recovery.
No longer the premier of Manitoba, to be sitting as a non-cabinet minister in the current government. It just didn't make sense for him to stick around.
Pallister was first elected MLA for Fort White in 2012, which was the same year he became leader of the Conservative Party in Manitoba. He then became Premier of Manitoba in 2016, which lasted until September 2021, when interim Premier Kelvin Gertsen took over. Adams says this is a long political chapter that is closed for Pallister.
He's had a long run, close to 30 years, and he probably figured it was time to move on and have a by-election in Fort White, where he was sitting as the MLA.
A by-election will now be called as the seat for Fort White is vacant. The date for this has not been set at this time. Adams says it could be a little while before this gets called, but says the open seat is a major opportunity for some.
Shelley Glover, if she wins the leadership of the PC party on October 30th, she will be looking for a seat to be in the Assembly, so the Fort White one would be the logical place for her to run.
Watt Canoe taking to social media expressing his thoughts on Pallister's resignation. He writes, quote, goodbye, Mr. Pallister. It's going to be pretty tough for the PCs to try and distance themselves from the health cuts, pandemic failures, hydro rates hikes, and on and on. He looms large over everything they do because they're still pursuing his plan. Adams says this will most likely be the last time we see Pallister involved in politics.
There are positions that are offered to you in the corporate world, on corporate boards of directors, and also on different crown agencies, federal and provincial. If Aaron O'Toole or the Conservative Party were to win power in the next couple of years, there would be a higher likelihood that Brian Pallister would find some offerings.
The PCs will select a new leader on October 30th. In Winnipeg, Purpose City News.
Gravitas, co-presented by Fuda Kushak. Choose what really matters.
Tonight I would like to begin with a video. This is China's Kunming city. The pictures are from August this year. On your screen are 15 high-rise buildings. All of them are apartments. For 8 years, these 15 buildings have just stood here. The developer ran out of money, so the apartments were never really completed. Chinese authorities finally woke up last month. They planted 85,000 bombs, 85,000 bombs, and decided to blow up everything. Onlookers were heard screaming when that happened. What? These dramatic pictures will now become a common sight in China. More unfinished buildings will be blown up by authorities. Imagine what this does to people who put their life savings in these apartments. Why are Chinese authorities doing this? Because China's property bubble is starting to burst. And why should you worry about this? Because the whole world is going to feel the shockwaves. Almost 2 years back, remember, China exported a pandemic and covered up its mistakes. The world felt the impact. It's still feeling the impact. Now, a financial crisis is brewing in China, and the Communist Party is trying to cover that up too. Tonight, we'll show you how they're doing it. Almost 10 days back, we told you about Evergrande, the world's most indebted property developer. It owes more than $300 billion to its creditors in China and around the world. But Evergrande does not have the money to pay back these loans. Weeks back, creditors began lining up outside the company offices to get their money back. Some even tried to commit suicide. They were desperate. They wanted to get their life savings back. Now their worst fears are coming true. Evergrande has begun missing its payments. Last week, the company failed to make an interest payment on a bond. It was supposed to pay $83.5 million. The deadline was Thursday. It did not happen. Evergrande did not have the money to pay. The company has secured a 30-day grace period to make the payment now. But what happens if it fails to pay back? A default will be declared. And that's very much a possibility. The bondholders do not know if they'll get their payment. Who are these bondholders? Many of them are average Chinese citizens. If Evergrande defaults, they will all lose their life savings. Their wealth is going to be wiped out, and that is just the tip of the iceberg. The fallout of Evergrande's collapse would be far-reaching. The company owes more than 171 domestic banks and 121 other financial firms, and they all fear defaults. Evergrande is on the brink of a collapse. If the company declares bankruptcy, it will lead to a collapse of the financial system in China. The future of the Chinese economy is at stake, and this is not an exaggeration. So what is being done about Evergrande? China has largely been silent about the crisis, but behind the scenes it is resorting to censorship and crackdowns to contain the damage. China used the same tools to hide its mistakes during the pandemic, and now the Communist Party is deploying the same tactics to hide a financial contagion. Local governments are issuing notices. They want Communist Party officials and companies to look out for any protests. Officials have been asked to watch angry citizens like aggrieved home buyers or unpaid contractors, even former staffers of Evergrande who were laid off. Why are these people being tracked? And we found the answer to this question in a directive from the Housing Department in Ningxiang County. Let me quote from it. This is what it says. Follow the demand to spot them early, diffuse early, control early, and deal with early. The heads of property development firms must personally take in hand the work of dealing with petitions and maintaining stability. Now, Chinese officials fear the protests could get out of hand, so they want local officers to nip them in the bud. In the meantime, Beijing is trying to keep the markets afloat. Last week, China's central bank pumped $71 billion into the financial system. This extra money is supposed to calm the investors, give the message that there is enough money to keep the banking system afloat. This is like using Band-Aid to fix a wound that needs surgery. How long can China prop up the markets? Cash injections help in the short term. They might hide the symptoms of distress for a while, but they will never be able to treat the malaise of Chinese economy. The fact is that there is a real estate bubble in China. It is fueled by debt and kept afloat by money that does not really exist. The Evergrande crisis is just the beginning. The actual crisis is much bigger. As of 2018, 50 million homes, 50 million homes were lying vacant in China. These apartments and houses were built but found no buyers. And China, has many ghost cities, acres of concrete with no takers. According to one assessment, there is enough empty property in China to house more than 90 million people. And I'll put that figure in perspective for you. There are enough empty homes in China to fit in populations of 5 G7 countries. Citizens from France, Germany, Italy, the UK, and Canada, they can all fit into the empty apartments of China. So there are millions of homes lying empty. There are no buyers. What do you think will happen to the developers who built these properties? Sooner or later, they will default, just like Evergrande. Investment banking firm UBS has released an assessment. It says there are at least 10 developers in China today who face the risk of defaults. So there could be more Evergrandes in the near future. China's real estate sector is like a house of cards at the moment. The world should brace for its collapse. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.
Gravitas, co-presented by Skoda. Kushak, choose what really matters.
What happens when you combine paranoia and power? You get Xi Jinping. He is the undisputed number one in China, but that's not enough for him. Xi Jinping wants to make a point about his power, about his legacy, and for that, Jinping. He is the undisputed number one in China, but that's not enough for him. Xi Jinping wants to make a point about his power, about his legacy, and for that, he is willing to sacrifice his own people. The biggest victim has been Evergrande, and we're not talking about the company bigwigs. We're talking about the employees. We're talking about the thousands of Chinese citizens who put their life savings into Evergrande. They are the big victims. On Monday, the company halted trading of its shares in Hong Kong. They gave no explanation why. Another company did the same. It's called Hobson Development Holding. Now, both these companies, Hobson and Evergrande, hinted at a big announcement. Hobson is all set to acquire stakes in Evergrande, 51% of their property management for $5 billion.
I fucking can't stand
This is what Chinese state media is reporting, $5 billion. It's a drop in the ocean. Evergrande's total debt is $305 billion. That's around 2% of China's GDP. Selling assets is a temporary fix. It may pay the bills, but it will not rescue the company. For that, Evergrande will have to resume construction projects. It will have to sell off inventory, and that's not happening anytime soon. You see, for the rest of the world,
I still can't believe that, after all this time, my dream.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn, reflecting on the Soviet Union's descent into totalitarian rule in the mid-20th century, and all the things that could have been done to prevent it, wrote the following. If we didn't love freedom enough, and even more, we had no awareness of the real situation, we hurried to submit. We submitted with pleasure. We purely and simply deserved everything that happened afterward. The 20th century clearly shows that totalitarianism is not a solution to any problem, but a social ill of the most horrific kind. More innocent men, women, and children were killed by the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century than by natural disasters, pandemics, or even the two world wars. If, therefore, we are unfortunate enough to be living in a world flirting with the sickness of totalitarianism, what can we do to escape? In this video, relying on the insights of those who studied and lived under totalitarian rule, we are going to explore what is called the forward escape from the control of the cruel and twisted minds of would-be totalitarians. To understand what this form of escape entails, we will contrast it with two other ways to escape from the hardships of living through an attempted totalitarian takeover: the backward escape and the physical escape. The backward escape entails dulling one's awareness of the reality and precariousness of one's situation through the use of drugs and alcohol, or by zoning out in front of screens for hours on end. The backward escape can provide short-term relief to feelings of anxiety, depression, and boredom, but the more one relies on such activities, the more one's mental health deteriorates. Furthermore, the backward escape does nothing to prevent the rise of totalitarianism, as it promotes docility, passivity, and apathy, all traits that make people more manipulable and controllable, or as Dr. Joost Meerlo explained in his book on totalitarianism, the cult of passivity and so-called relaxation is one of the most dangerous developments of our times. Essentially, it represents a camouflage pattern, a double wish not to see the dangers and challenges of life and not to be seen. Silent, lonely relaxation with alcohol, sweets, and scream may soothe the mind into a passivity that may gradually make it vulnerable to the seductive ideology of some feared enemy. Denying the danger of totalitarianism through passivity may gradually surrender to its blandishments those who were initially afraid of it. An alternative to the backward escape is the physical escape, which is to relocate to a place that offers more freedom. This form of escape has many benefits, for given that we have one chance at life. Why not live somewhere absent the stifling control of corrupt and power-hungry politicians and bureaucrats? But there are problems with this form of escape. Firstly, for many people, it is not practical to pack up and move to a new land. Furthermore, if we live at a time when the rise of tyranny is a global phenomenon, the practicality of the physical escape diminishes further, as the sought-after pockets of freedom are few and far between. What is more, if totalitarianism is permitted to proliferate, the places that are free now may not remain so for long. Running away, like escaping backward, is not the ideal solution to the rise of totalitarianism. Instead, the solution is to escape forward into a new and better reality. What does the forward escape entail? To answer this question, we need to dispel with the notion that totalitarianism can be defeated through compliance. Many people cede to the commands of would-be totalitarians because they believe that so doing is the quickest means to return to some semblance of normality. But this is a cowardly and ignorant way to act, for compliance only emboldens totalitarian regimes, a point emphasized by the political philosopher Hannah Arendt in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. The most characteristic aspect of totalitarian terror is that it is let loose when all organized opposition has died down, and the totalitarian terror knows that he no longer need be afraid. Stalin started his gigantic purges not in 1928 when he conceded, "We have internal enemies," but in 1934, when all former opponents had confessed their errors, and Stalin himself, at the 17th Party Congress, declared, "There is nothing more to prove, and, it seems, no one to fight." Compliance is the food that feeds totalitarians. Compliance is not, and never will be, the path back to some form of normality. Rather, non-compliance and civil disobedience are essential to counter the rise of totalitarian rule. But in addition to resistance, a forward escape into a reality absent the sickness of totalitarian rule requires the construction of a parallel society. A parallel society serves two main purposes. It offers pockets of freedom to those rejected by the totalitarian system or who refuse to participate in it, and it forms the foundation for a new society that can grow out of the ashes of the destruction wrought by the totalitarians. Or as Václav Havel, a dissident under the communist rule of Czechoslovakia, explains in his book, The Power of the Powerless, when those who have decided to live within the truth have been denied any direct influence on the existing social structures, not to mention the opportunity to participate in them, and when these people begin to create what I have called the independent life of society, this independent life begins of itself to become structured in a certain way. These parallel structures do not grow out of a theoretical vision of systemic change. There are no political sects involved, but from the aims of life and the authentic needs of real people. There are innumerable ways to contribute to the construction of a parallel society. One can build technologies that promote freedom, or agoristic economic institutions that further voluntary exchange. One can run a business that resists implementing unjust laws or mandates, or one can create media or educational institutions that counter the lies and propaganda of the state. Or one can create music, literature, or artwork that counters the staleness of totalitarian culture. The parallel society is a decentralized and voluntary alternative to the centralized and coercive control of the totalitarian society. And as Havel explains, one of the most important tasks the dissident movements have set themselves is to support and develop parallel social structures. What else are those initial attempts at social self-organization and the efforts of a certain part of society to rid itself of the self-sustaining aspects of totalitarianism and, thus, to extricate itself radically from its involvement in the totalitarian system? And as he explains further, It would be quite wrong to understand the parallel structures in the parallel society as a retreat into a ghetto and as an act of isolation, addressing itself only to the welfare of those who had decided on such a course. The ultimate phase of this process is the situation in which the official structures simply begin withering away and dying off, to be replaced by new structures that have evolved from below and are put together in a fundamentally different way. The construction of a parallel society, however, is not merely a long-term solution to totalitarian destruction, but also serves to counter the rise of totalitarian rule. For the act of building parallel social structures reveals that not everyone will just roll over and submit to total state control. And as was noted by Hannah Arendt, this helps keep the would-be totalitarians in check. This process also counters the social atomization that comes with totalitarian rule by promoting voluntary communal bonds between those who cherish freedom. And as an added benefit for those who partake in this process, it can serve as a healthy vehicle to escape the day-to-day feelings of anxiety, boredom, and depression that accompany living in a world teetering with a descent into totalitarianism. For if we pick a goal to help in the construction of the parallel society and work towards it in a disciplined and focused manner, we give our life more meaning and we open up the possibility of attaining the peak experiential states of flow and rausch. Flow is an optimal state of consciousness in which attention is so narrowly focused on an activity that a sense of time fades, along with the troubles and concerns of day-to-day life. Rausch, on the other hand, is the word Nietzsche used for a peak cognitive state similar to flow. What is essential in Rausch, wrote Nietzsche, is the feeling of increased strength and fullness. Rausch is an emergent byproduct of focused attempts to effectuate real-world change. And when in Rausch, as in flow, we perform at our best. Or as John Richardson explains in Nietzsche's New Darwinism, in Rausch, the organism feels its capacities at a peak and takes pleasure in its heightened potency. These capacities are drives to work on the world, and in Rausch, one feels oneself overfull with them, bursting to change things to fit oneself. Both flow and Rausch are healthy ways to escape from the day-to-day miseries of living in a sick and corrupted society. Unlike the numbing experiential zones of the backward escape, which weaken us in body and mind, flow and Rausch strengthen us and increase our feelings of power. The more people who experience flow and Rausch, the harder it is for those in power to herd a populace into the chains of totalitarian servitude. And as Alexander Solzhenitsyn warned, no weapons, no matter how powerful, can help the West until it overcomes its loss of willpower. To attempt the forward escape by contributing to the creation of a parallel society, and in the process attaining the states of flow and Rausch, comes with risks. And success is not guaranteed, but it is a far better option than merely sitting passively by, just hoping things will get better. Hope, in reality, claimed Nietzsche, is the worst of all evils because it prolongs the torments of man. In place of mere hope, courageous action from as many people as possible is needed to prevent the rise of totalitarian rule. And the sooner people act in defiance of would-be totalitarians, the greater the chance of success. For the mistake that was made over and over again in the totalitarian countries of the 20th century was that people didn't act soon enough. Milton Mayer, in his book They Thought They Were Free, interviews an individual who lived through Hitler's rule, and his words should serve as a warning for those who live in a world at risk of being engulfed by the life-destroying machinery of totalitarian rule. You wait for one great shocking occasion, thinking that others, when such a shock comes, will join with you in resisting somehow. But the one great shocking occasion, when tens or hundreds of thousands will join with you, never comes. If the last and worst act of the whole regime had come immediately after the first and smallest, thousands, yes, millions would have been sufficiently shocked. But of course, this isn't the way it happens. In between comes all the hundreds of little steps, some of them imperceptible, each of them preparing you not to be shocked by the next. And one day, too late, your principles, if you were ever sensible of them, all rush in upon you, and you see that everything has changed. Now you live in a world of heat and fear. and the people who keep in fear do not even know it themselves. When everyone is transformed, no one is transformed. For nonconformity, the world whips you with its displeasure. This remark by Ralph Waldo Emerson makes it clear that the forces of conformity were quite strong when he lived nearly 200 years ago. However, he would likely be surprised at the extent to which the whipping of nonconformists has now been made possible with the emergence of social media and other mass communication technologies. No longer is conformity primarily enforced by members of one's community, but rather through online social networks, people from all over the world can ostracize, shame, and ridicule those who fail to hold beliefs or display behaviors which are considered socially acceptable. But this magnified ability to enforce conformity comes at a price, as it is the nonconformists who bring forth the new ideas, creations, and ways of living which produce a vibrant society. Furthermore, many who have reflected on the human condition have suggested that too much.
I think today's speech from the throne has to be deeply, deeply disappointing for the people of Ontario. Not for the first time since this pandemic began, we see nothing but empty rhetoric from Doug Ford, especially at this critically important time for our province. So, for example, when I think about the fact that I just dropped my daughters off at school before heading down to Queen's Park this morning, the entire speech from the throne, not one mention of the word education. We just came off the federal election campaign where the people of Ontario overwhelmingly supported $10 a day licensed childcare. Nothing in today's speech from the throne about that for the families of Ontario.
Yeah, fucking stupid.
We have been talking about the need
Fuck
to
your
protect
fucking
essential
dumbass
workers
fucking kid.
for years, but certainly during this pandemic. Nothing today on
You don't get
page
to
60
pay to be a fucking parent.
to be
Sorry.
extended and broadened and deepened to protect those who have literally kept Ontarians safe throughout this pandemic. Again, nothing but empty rhetoric from Doug Ford and his government today, and absolutely shocking that we had to wait this long to hear so little from someone who's been in hiding for months.
It's got everything a house does. It's just 20 feet underground. Well, what about a tree or a window that's not looking at some worms? I mean, that's one of the main things I like about the house. It's not 20 feet under the ground. That's what I'm saying. It does everything a leg does, except it's been chopped up and it's floating down the sea. And you thinking about living off grid is all the chaos in the world, all the conflict, all the fear and dread, making you think, I want to get right off this grid. Well, whether you're a billionaire thinking about creating a bunker or someone who's been deprived of economic opportunity because of the way that the pandemic and AI evolution is affecting your life, the chances are that off-grid living might be for you. Let's look at alternative social models, whether you're a billionaire, by billionaires, or someone that's not a billionaire. Hello, everyone else.
You were one of those lucky people that can travel anywhere. Yes, ma'am. And they sometimes call you Max.
Why are people considering this? Concerns about health, personal safety, security, and cybersecurity are leading to increasing interest in off-grid living, with communities growing across America. The Oscar-winning film Nomadland looked at what happens when people denied access to industry because of the way that the workforce is changing, the way that manufacturing is changing, the way that energy production is changing, the way that technology is taking human jobs. What happens when people, in the case of that film, a middle-class, middle-aged person has to step out of society and find a new way of life? Are these new ways of life actually, as it says in the film, a return to a kind of pioneering tradition?
or are they something to be ashamed of? In my podcast, Under the Skin, I spoke to Yuval Noah Harari about the impact of artificial intelligence on society and the likelihood of increasingly diverse ways of living.
Yeah, they were very concerned. I was struck by the first question that was, about the useless class.
He's talking about me and him did this event at a school in South London where Yuval Noah Harari sort of told the kids, hey, you guys should all learn the program if you want to participate in the economy. And I said, shouldn't they be focusing on new systems, new political systems, new social systems, rather than kowtowing to the relentless robot march of power? And of course, Yuval Noah Harari saw the world differently. He explained that now.
And somebody saying, but wait, there is a useless class already.
Some would argue that's the upper class, elite classes that contribute very little to society while hoovering up all of its resources. Vacuuming up, shall we? Let's not use a brand name. Oh, they've got us by the balls.
It's not a forecast for 20 or 30 years from now. There are people who are viewed or even view themselves as useless, as outside the system right now.
That's the problem with post-industrial or technological society, is utility is presumed. This is society, this is how the society works, and if you don't operate within that society, you can F off. Well, that's already at play, of course. That's what homelessness is. That means you can't participate in this economic system because you don't have the skills to exchange your labour for money, so you are surplusness. That's why I'm struck when I meet people that are living in a different way, like the woman Anatar that I met and talked about in my Audible original Revelation. She'd set up her own system of living in the woods. Now, she wasn't literally off-grid because she was getting electricity from somewhere. I don't think it was solar. She was plugged in or something, but she was living in the woods in a dignified way. It wasn't like she'd fallen through the cracks of society, that she was spilled on the side of the road. No, she's got like a kitchen in there. Like I was sort of amazed. She's had a separate sort of tent space for a bedroom. What I mean to say is it wasn't like, oh, this is a person living out their mental illness. They're decaying. Let's watch them atrophy at the side of the road. No, this is a person flourishing in a different system. It sparked something in me. It made me feel there are different ways of living. Don't you continually ask yourself, would I actually be more happy if instead of trying to compete and grab hold and grasp and keep this shit going, if I just went, I'm not going to try anymore, I'm going to go and live different. I'm going to live in a different community. I'm going to set myself free from the tyranny of economics and try and live differently. Some people, some of you, might not even feel that you have that as an opportunity. Me, I feel like afraid to. I'm like a prisoner of comfort. No, but I've got my stuff here, but perhaps this is something we're all going to have to start considering.
So this was, something very sad to hear, but I think very true.
Yuval Noah Harari posits that a new unworking class will be created. Some people talk about universal basic income being a potential solution. But I feel like society should be created in order to serve humans. Not humans should be created in order to serve society. As Mark Fisher always argued, and as I always tell you, mental illness is a social condition. A lot of us start to go crazy. You think, oh God, I don't know what to do. I can't cope with the pressure. I can't cope with the financial pressure. I'm going to pay all these bills. Well, you short circuit. Those are not natural considerations.
In a secret location in Kansas, what was once a nuclear missile base, now in private hands.
It's not only people that can't compete in our economic culture that are considering what will happen after the apocalypse or if society crumbles. It's people that are at the very pinnacle of our culture. They're not to the pyramid because of the Freemasons, but except the people though. The people at the very pinnacle of our culture are also considering what happens post-society, what happens after the fall. Let's look at the phenomena of billionaire bankers.
Meet doomsday entrepreneur Larry Hall.
I don't know the concept of a doomsday entrepreneur. Trouble you. I'm an entrepreneur. Oh, brilliant. When does the money all come in? Doomsday.
He's converted a Cold War silo into a post-apocalyptic refuge for the very rich.
There's been an apocalypse. Time to help those unsung heroes, our old friends, the very rich. Come on in, very rich. Help us, help us. We truly are very rich. Why's your hand out for? Something useful.
So you fit in these big doors here?
These are all new. Yeah, these are new. I love that he's like appraisal of a billionaire bunker, the raison d'etre of which presumes the end of society.
been discussed like he's on grand design. These doors, they're all new, they're all new. This is where we put the dead bodies of the people that couldn't make it. We started to use children's corpses as a fuel resource in there. That's brilliant, that's brilliant. I know, I thought of it. I'm a doomsday entrepreneur, it's what I do. His clients believe America's approaching collapse. And when it does, they'll need somewhere to hide from crowds of desperate people. There's a crowd of desperate people, and we are very, very rich. What should we do? Hide!
The facility is very well fortified, and guns and grenades and stuff won't bother this place.
Guns, right? How can you have as the sort of key modus operandi of your billionaire bunker attacking us? They're attacking. We got these guns and grenades. Who's throwing that? It's not going to be zombies. It's not going to be aliens. It's you. It's for you. And in a way, like I've said to you before, that law implies violence, i.e., you don't pay a traffic fine. In the end, the guy's coming to take your TV or take you. This tells you the way things are going. Like, people that are in the know and can afford it are going, we best build some bunkers for that bit where everyone goes nuts and tries to come and kill us. Yeah, all right. What are the doors going to be like? They're going to be terrific.
When you get here and you hit a place that's nuclear hardened, that we can reach out and touch people. I mean, we don't have to let them come and damage the facility. We can keep them at bay.
Even if I reach out and touch, they're going to reach out and touch you. The survival complex has 12 stories of underground apartments and luxury facilities, each floor costing $3 million.
This is one of the condos. A 3-bedroom, 2-bath unit. This is the dining area. There's a jacuzzi tub here.
That's the wrong lesson that's been learned there, isn't it? It's like you shooted an idiot child through. Have you seen what happens if you don't share? If you don't create a fairer society? Just, well, what happens? We build an underground bunker and we carry on with exactly what we were doing.
Oh. The toilets are interesting. You can use them in a bidet mode. Everything from the water temperature to the spray patterns.
Have a point that you're designing an underground toilet to wash feces off your underground app because of the apocalypse. Do you not think at that point we could divert these resources?
Plenty of room for all the stuff and very normal.
Not that normal, though, is it? Being in an underground bunker that you're in because everyone else is dead. There's an underground farm to grow food and raise fish. Address the actual problem. Don't build an underground fish farm next to the cinema rather than think, oh, do you know what? I don't need all this stuff. Look, you can level the same thing at me. The machine that creates this kind of solution is embedded in my head. It's in all of our heads. When I do these videos, I'm doing them from the perspective of, hi, I've realised all this stuff. I'm here now. I'm with you, trying to work out what to do, not only about the external problems of this culture, but the impact of this culture on me, on my natural instincts and impulses and the way they've been controlled, harbored, harnessed, directed. So what is me anymore if I'm invisibly linked to ideologies as well as different people, all the kinds of relationships that we have? At some point we're going to have to look at the only point of change is an inner one. That's the first thing that has to be altered. And I think that can only be done collectively. Alone, it's terrifying to consider. A cinema, so you could while away the apocalypse watching films.
Well, you will have a certain amount of downtime where you want to not be bored.
You certainly will have some downtime because nothing exists anymore. Just a horrible wasteland, a constant reminder of the terrible decisions made. I think I might watch Terminator 2 and The Matrix, look out the window, see if there's anything remotely different. Even a swimming pool. If it sounds extraordinary, preparing for America's collapse, or prepping as they call it, is increasingly common in a country losing confidence in its government. Perhaps the reason people, no matter where we fall on the economic scale, are considering off-grid or bunker living is because of the changes brought about by the pandemic and by, globalization unleashed as we've been experiencing it. During the pandemic, the collective wealth of American billionaires leapt by 1.62 trillion, or by 55%. This year's growth comes on top of a 19-fold increase in billionaire wealth over 31 years. The 1.3 trillion wealth gain could pay for a stimulus check of $3,900 for every one of the 331 million people in the United States. That's just a bit of wealth distribution chat there. American billionaires held over 4 times more wealth than the 165 million Americans in society's bottom half. Again, this is not a viable or sustainable distribution of resources. Over 76 million people, humans like you, lost work during the pandemic. Nearly 100,000 businesses have permanently closed. 12 million workers have lost employer-sponsored health insurance, and 24 million adults reported that their household had not had enough food in the past week. Those statistics point to the system failing. They point to the need for change. Obviously, billionaires are preparing in their way. Everybody should be looking at alternative ways of living.
Let's look at their track record. How would you rate the U.S. government's performance for Katrina? How would you rate it for Sandy? I wouldn't be giving them any stellar grades. And that was on; those are relatively localized events. So I think that would be a bad bet to think that the government's going to be there to save you.
It's from quite a libertarian perspective, i.e. individual versus state. But in a way, the creation of communities that are extraneous or at least external to existing systems is precisely what's being discussed in Nomadland and in other YouTube videos about off-grid living. What happens if the state fails? What happens if corporations, in the pursuit of their objective, which is profit, and only serving you as an inadvertent byproduct, what happens if it reaches an irreversible point of decline? Well, we're going to have to set up alternative systems. Most of us are just carrying on with life, thinking, hopefully this will work out, hopefully this will work out. But I don't know if you're like me, but I'm increasingly thinking, hold on, I've got kids. Should we be looking to set up some totally different community with different values, different ethics, a true practice of democracy, fairness, true alliance with the planet and one another? I can't think about that on the scale of billions of people. That would be, mental illness back in town. I think about it in terms of groups, little groups. Perhaps what we need is to look at templates for living, different, not necessarily nomadic, maybe settled, but certainly discrete systems of living. In a way, it's as much anarchist as it is libertarian. I don't mean anarchist to mean chaos. I mean anarchist as in anarchism, democracy, wherever possible, the lateral power systems, horizontal power systems rather than vertical power systems. These are our resources. These are our challenges. This is our skill set. How shall we resolve it?
This is the armory. We can't go in there and film, but
You won't let us film in there?
no, we can't go in there.
They've got a terrifying armory down in that nuclear bunker. And the fella there in the background, that poor guy, he's been recruited from the crowd who should be attacking the bunker. He's there in his combat pants, turning the gun on his fellows. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? Whether it was my conversation with Yuval Noah Harari, in which he said that our current economic and technological systems are going to create an underclass, or whether it's this billionaire bunker farminess. The fact is, you can only do this without dumb compliance. That's why Animal Farm is such a masterful allegory. That we are domesticated farm animals. Our energy is being used in the same way as if it were our milk or our wool. The only option we have is to awaken from the illusion of our disempowerment and refuse to cooperate. Non-cooperation and the creation of alternative systems. I don't know what kind of optimistic lunatic thinks you're going to be able to squeeze the kind of ideas required for real change through the toothpaste tube of democracy. It's always going to produce the same result. It's set up by the people that require the system to not alter. So it can never radically alter. Have you noticed yet that things ain't that different under Joe Biden than they were under the... No, he's going to do this thing where people are going to be taxed more. Well, let's see it. Let's see how radical it is. Let's see if Amazon and all of the companies that supported Biden's pursuit of office are like, yeah, this is a good idea. Tax us more. Tax us till we can't do what we do anymore. They're not going to do that. They are operating cooperatively. They are one thing. There ain't no difference between them.
So it's called Sniper's Post down there, is that?
Yes.
Is that for real? They got a sniper who could go in that place?
We do.
There seems to be no shortage of rich Americans afraid of the future.
Rich Americans afraid of the future. It's so weird, isn't it? Because that's the problem. We're going to solve this problem by carrying on in exactly the direction that got us in this situation. But luckily, we are armed.
These days, the fear market is booming.
You can't build them fast. I can't build them fast enough right now.
How far out do you want to go before looking in? How far out do you want to go? We're building bunkers now. We're going to just get the ships, take us up to the moon and that. I'm going to download my consciousness into an ANSIG. But start meditating. Start waking up. There are different. We could stop now. Everyone alive now is going to be dead in 100 years. Culture is a legacy and tradition. They're dead ideas revived continually by each new generation. You could just go, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to do this. There are some beautiful, universal, perennial values that we must and ought preserve. But if we don't, like in your own life, if you don't respond to change, that's madness, isn't it? Like if I'm just like carrying on now as a 45-year-old man with 2 children, how I was carrying on when I was 25 or 30 years old, that's mental illness. That's mental illness. We're doing that as a culture. We're trying to act like, hey, baby, this isn't Renaissance Florence. We're not there anymore. We're not in Paris in the 1920s. This is 2021. We're in serious trouble. It's time to awaken. It's time to respond to the reality of our time.
It's got everything a house does. It's just 20 feet underground.
Well, what about a tree or a window that's not looking at some worms? I mean, that's one of the main things I like about the house. It's not 20 feet under the ground. That's like saying it does everything a leg does, except it's been chopped up and it's floating down the sea.
In the 60s, they only worried about the nuclear attacks from Cuba and Russia. Now we have to worry about biological attacks, or chemical warfare, terrorist threats, economic crash, nuclear fallout, nuclear threats from Korea and China. I mean, I hope it never happens, but mathematically, it all adds up to Armageddon.
Thanks for coming. It's been a lovely conversation, but we're probably going to give the position to someone a bit more optimistic.
Down here, Armageddon, can we sit back and watch TV and enjoy it?
You can't enjoy Armageddon. It's a terrible, terrible disaster. The saddest thing of all being that it could be avoided. I mean, if you're the most fatalistic person, you think, well, ultimately, of course, all matter must dissipate, and there is a point where the sun itself explodes. Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I'm not at war with the cosmos, but surely we, as components of the cosmos, as any hack philosopher will tell you, and indeed the film Nomadland, there's stardust in your body. With the Noah's flood is still happening, as Melville said. The Big Bang is still happening. The expansion of the universe is still happening. We are nature. We're not separate from nature. Let's get in alignment with nature rather than continually prioritizing abstract systems that are opposed from above onto nature, even at the expense of our own survival. In a sense, the billionaire bunker story versus the off-grid experience is capitalism showing its hand. The end game, if it comes to it, we're going underground, and not in a jam way. We're going underground in relative luxury while you pick your way through the bones and radioactive dust. So, having seen this, what we should all be thinking about is alternative systems that may indeed prevent Armageddon, rather than how we're going to cope after it. Perhaps if we set an example collectively, creating fairer democratic systems, show that we can all operate with one another, even if we have wacky, crazy, different beliefs and ways of dressing and worshipping or not worshipping, forming our own fair society that are separate and abstract. I feel that sometimes we should, like the system, as you might call it, commercialism, corporatism, globalism, we should just treat it like some bully frozen out in the playground. Just don't talk to it anymore. Just don't vote in its elections. Just don't pay its taxes. Don't buy its products. It will go away. If you keep confronting it all the time, although actually you are supposed to do that with bullies. Look, anyway, the bully analogy was going to break down eventually. My point is this. Try to find new ways of surviving. Try to evolve new systems, which are all going to involve personal awakening. There's no way getting around that, because for me, if I'm going to live without all of my stuff, my precious tea towel, my former olive oil bottle, I'm going to have to change. I'm going to have to break out of my own prisons, my own systems of control that are clearly linked into the ones that dominate us. And you are too. Let's try and prevent Armageddon. That's the main message of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, why not press like? Please comment. I read the comments, and sign up to my mailing list at russellbrand.com so we can start evolving and developing this system, this society. I do live calls, like one every week or one every 2 weeks, actually, completely free, in different time zones. You can get on the mailing list, sign up to it, and you can come on there, ask questions, chat to me. Thanks for watching the video. See you out there in Nomadland.
tonight concerns a public health crisis that's exposed the failure of American institutions. No, not that one. Not that one either. That's a good point, but not actually this time. Yep, there it is, the opioid epidemic. And if you're thinking, hold on, didn't you already do a show about this? You're wrong. We've actually done two of them. We thought it would be worth doing a third installment tonight anyway, for a couple of reasons. First, it's an epidemic that's still very much raging, exacerbated by both the pandemic and illicit fentanyl, to the point that last year, nearly 70,000 people died from opioid overdoses. That is the highest annual death toll ever. And second, you may have seen a bunch of headlines recently about trials and settlements taking place around the country. There have been so many of them, it can genuinely be hard to keep track. But we want to focus on just one company tonight, Purdue Pharma, whose rollout of OxyContin arguably fueled the opioid crisis. We've talked about their relentless push to sell OxyContin before, but more material has come out in the last couple of years, including this spectacular glimpse into a 1997 motivational sales meeting for the company's drug reps. Wow, that was Purdue's VP of Sales performing an OxyContin cover of Shout. And that has got to be one of the most upsetting decisions from the late 90s, right up there with Give Every Lonely Child an Electronic Imaginary Friend That Will Immediately Die, and Let's Set Every Sitcom in New York City and Make Sure the Twin Towers are prominently featured in the transition shots. Really reminds people they're there. Purdue Pharma is owned by the Sackler family. In recent years, Purdue and the Sacklers have found themselves being investigated by the DOJ and facing thousands of lawsuits followed by state and local governments, Native American tribes, hospitals, and individuals. And they've spent years working with an army of lawyers attempting to negotiate their way out of all of it, which has resulted in two major resolutions, including this big news from last October.
It's being hailed by the federal government as a major victory against a company whose drug, OxyContin, is part of the public health crisis of opioid addiction that has led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans. The maker of OxyContin admitted to defrauding regulators and paying illegal kickbacks to doctors.
It's true, Purdue has pled guilty to multiple felonies. And it is weird to hear news that sounds so genuinely good. It'd be really nice to get more of that once in a while, like no once-in-a-century weather events for the next few hours, or billionaire goes to space and dies there. You know, something heartwarming. That guilty plea is actually part of a much larger plan that we'll get into later, involving the company also filing for bankruptcy, and just this past March, submitting a reorganization plan that would end Sackler ownership. And the thing is, this might all sound like a major victory that the Sacklers are finally experiencing significant consequences. But unfortunately, that could not be farther from the truth. So tonight, with the bankruptcy confirmation hearing scheduled to begin later this week, let's talk about the Sackler family, how hard they've been fighting to defend their name, the details of the deal that they're attempting to strike, and why the whole thing is a bunch of bullshit. And let's start with a basic question. Who are the Sacklers? Well, the Sacklers are the descendants of three brothers, Arthur, Raymond, and Mortimer, who in 1952 bought the company that would eventually become Purdue Pharma. And while Arthur's branch of the family sold their stake decades ago before OxyContin was developed, the heirs of Raymond and Mortimer both benefited from, and in some cases actively managed, Purdue's boom years of selling opioids. Many Sacklers either worked at the company or served on its board. And as the Massachusetts AG points out, some of them were pretty hands-on.
They were in the boardroom. They owned the company. We have emails and memos that show the direct control that they exercised over sales and marketing. One of the Sackler family members went so far as to want to get in the car with Purdue sales reps and drive around to visit doctors' offices.
It's true. And doing a drug rep ride-along is about as hands-on as you can get. And quick side note there, just spare a thought for the sales rep in question. For sure, they too contributed to the overprescription of America and probably led to their own local mini epidemic. But nobody, not even Hitler, should have to sit in the car with their boss and talk about what exactly? The weather? And then when you run out of things to say about it, do what? Sit in silence? And then say, actually, I can go for a bathroom break right now, and have him say, screen to stop, and then what? You stop, and he waits in the car, and then when you get back, he looks inconvenienced. I would sooner throw myself out of the car in the middle of the freeway. Now, the man responsible for that ride-along was Richard Chapter, who was actually president of the company for years. And yet, interestingly, it is hard to find images of him other than that one. In fact, while the Sackers have relished slapping their family name on institutions, as individuals, they have tried to stay out of the spotlight. When Richard Sacker gave a deposition in 2015, Purdue fought hard to keep it private. That is why, in our last piece, we had a bunch of actors play him to convey important things, like the fact that he said, "I don't know," more than 100 times. Now, thankfully, that deposition has since been released, so you can finally watch the man in action.
How much money has Purdue, Frederick, or Purdue Pharma made off the sale of OxyContin? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I don't know. I don't know. But I just don't know.
Okay, the guy just oozes charisma. But honestly, having actually seen it, I think I prefer the version of we made.
How much money has Purdue Frederick or Purdue Pharma made off the sale of OxyContin?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. How many figurations do you know? I don't know. That is just objectively better. Now, while Richard was the most involved, he was not alone. His cousin Kathy Sacker was the officer of the company for years, and even claimed in emails that developing OxyContin was her idea. So, despite that fact, when Kathy was brought before Congress last year and asked to apologize for her role in the opioid crisis, she didn't exactly do that.
I have tried to figure out is there anything that I could have done differently, knowing what I knew then, not what I know now. And I have to say to you that there's nothing that I can find that I would have done differently.
Okay, first, that is definitely not an apology, Kathy, and second, come on. Nearly a year into a pandemic, that is just an unacceptable at-home setup. Put your laptop on a couple of books, upgrade your router. While you're at it, one click a ring light. So, Kathy, that's books, router, ring light. It's the little Zoom tricks that we all know that will help you look your best as you absolve yourself of responsibility for a massive public health crisis. But the Sackers haven't just been appearing at congressional hearings. Some have been trying hard to rehabilitate their image and even paint themselves as victims. Take David Sacker. He's Richard's son and a former board member himself. He gave an interview to Vanity Fair featuring this portrait, which, by the way, looks like it should be a poster for natural family planning in a Christian health trip. And in it, he complains, "My 4-year-old came home from nursery school and asked, 'Why are my friends telling me that our family's work is killing people?' Which just does not seem remotely credible. For start, everyone knows that is not how 4-year-olds talk. You're missing 8 ums, 50 and 3 times they're completely out of breath for no reason, and 5 complete trail-offs. I call bullshit on that whole fake anecdote. But that is just the beginning. David from the family was also involved in the launch of a pro-Sacker website that aims to correct the record called judgeforyourselves.info, which is shocking for a number of first because billionaires for some reason chose not to spurge for the .com, but also because of just how petty the website is. It features a list of outlets that mistakenly used the brand's name OxyContin when they meant the generic oxycodone, including a college newspaper, and over 7 hours of video presentations in which a catastrophically uncharismatic lawyer attempts to disprove every legal argument ever made against the Sackers and Purdue. This terrible website of self-serving nonsense has been promoted by, among others, Joss Sacker. That is David's wife. You may remember her from her failure to face the camera in Vanity Fair. Now, even though Joss isn't directly involved in the family business, she actually talks more publicly than most Sackers. She has a code called Empty, or Le Bulldog Niehon, which translates to the wine-making bulldogs, and is marketed as her members-only wine and social club. Joss was also wanting to use the Town and Country, which she complained about how unfairly the press treats both her and her family, noting that the previous article wouldn't refer to her as Dr. Joss Sacker, despite her telling them she had a PhD in linguistics, and going on to say they're going to regret fucking with a linguist. And that is one hell of a claim, Joss, because nobody is intimidated by linguists. You're basically an English major who wasted more time. I'll fuck with a linguist all day long, I'll show you. How do you make proper nouns into a double negative? Than David. Boom. Linguist, fuck with. So to recap, it is pretty clear some sappers have been working extremely hard to try and engender public sympathy, but the real battle the family's been fighting has been a legal one. And that is what I want to spend the rest of this piece talking about, because while the details of what the sappers are doing are incredibly complicated, the end result is both simple and absolutely infuriating. And let's start with that deal you heard about earlier, where Purdue pled guilty to 3 felonies. It sounded like some good news, but there are some major asterisks there. Because while the company pled guilty to those charges, no individuals did, and certainly no Sacklers, and that alone is a big deal to them. In fact, this one has Kathy jumped to remind everyone of that fact during their congressional hearing.
Sackler family through Purdue has 3 felony convictions, but no one's in jail, and it has its billions still.
Excuse me, the Sackler family doesn't have a felony conviction. Purdue Pharma has a felony conviction. I'm an individual person.
Okay, hold on. I do get the point that you're making there, but the fact is, Purdue is made up of individual people who control it. Think of Purdue like Laptop. If Laptop threatened to kill the president on live TV, Laptop wouldn't get in trouble or go to prison. Shari Lewis would. Why? Because Laptop is a puppet who does whatever the fuck Shari Lewis tells Laptop to do. Now, the Sackers might argue that Purdue is controlled by many people, including non-family members, and while they're not facing criminal charges, they are still facing consequences. But here is the thing. Are they? Are they really? And that brings us back to the bankruptcy that I mentioned earlier, because the bankruptcy deal that Purdue has proposed is the vehicle through which the Sackers are likely to escape any true accountability. Very basic. Purdue was buried in thousands of lawsuits, and rather than fighting them separately, the company filed for bankruptcy, negotiating to resolve all of its debts in one place. This proposed deal requires, among other things, the Sackers relinquish ownership of Purdue, which will be turned into a public benefit company whose profits will go towards fighting the opioid epidemic. Now, the company claims the bankruptcy will deliver more than $10 billion in value. But a few things about that. First, the Sackers themselves are only contributing around $4.3 billion to that settlement, which I know does sound like a lot, until you learn the family has assets of around $11 billion, which is a massive amount of money. And I guess that is what happens when your company makes an addictive product and pushes its employees to... I just saw that 10 minutes ago, and somehow it's gotten even worse. Now, also, you may want to know, regarding the Sackler family network, a fair amount of it was built up in a very particular period, because from 2008 to 2017, even as the opioid epidemic was kicking into high gear, more than $10 billion was transferred out of the company for the benefit of the family. Now, the Sacklers fiercely maintained that those transfers were proper, but the DOJ alleged that they were made to hinder future creditors. In other words, to get the money out of the company so that the Sacklers could protect it. And they found some pretty damning evidence, particularly from David Sackler, who seemed to direct express views over lawsuits taking the family money back in 2007, writing in an email, "We're rich, for how long? Until rich suits get through to the family." And David, but don't see how you get an open email. I mean, don't send it in mail, don't speak it, don't think it, and ideally, don't receive an upbringing that would plant a thought in your mind, but bare minimum, keep it out of the permanent legal record. And you're thinking, well, so they transferred money to the family, but people can still pursue claims against the Sacklers directly, right? Well, no, because here is the really insidious part. Well, there are approximately 400 civil suits that do name the Sacklers themselves. The family is insisting they will only agree to this settlement if they get what is called a non-consensual third-party release. And this thing is bullshit. Because if they get it, all current lawsuits against the Sacklers evaporate, and no future lawsuits can be filed, meaning that the Sacklers, who didn't file for personal bankruptcy themselves, remember, are basically off the hook. And if it sounds weird to you, that a company can declare bankruptcy and then a bunch of individuals get shielded from liability. That's because it is. It's really fucking weird. In fact, some bankruptcy courts don't allow these third-party releases at all, but Purdue very carefully chose one that they knew probably would. A few months before filing for bankruptcy, Purdue changed one of its official corporate addresses to one in White Plains, New York, at which it's never conducted business, and where there is only one bankruptcy judge who, completely coincidentally, has supported third-party releases in the past, which is all a pretty obvious tactic, isn't it? It's not that they moved to White Plains for any other reason. If you look up things to do in White Plains, the first result you get, and this is true, is a TripAdvisor page recommending a helicopter tour of New York City, which is just incredible. Come visit White Plains, where you can immediately leave and go look at somewhere more interesting to live. And the Sacklers third-party release is comprehensive, stating that the release party shall be conclusively, absolutely, unconditionally, irrevocably, fully, finally, forever, and permanently released from any and all claims of any kind from the beginning of time. And this is the list of every person and entity they want covered. It contains over 200 companies and 200 more trusts where the Sacklers have tucked their money away. This release is ludicrously broad, which is probably why the AGs of 9 states and DC are still objecting to it, and 2 branches of the DOJ have said it violates the US Constitution and specifically violates due process because it deprives individuals of an opportunity to be heard. And yet, incredibly, despite all of this, it is widely assumed that this whole deal is going to go ahead. And while it sounds completely terrible to me, I will say at least one person thinks that it's actually a very good thing. Although I will say that one person is Purdue's current chairman.
This is a milestone in public health history. Never before have you seen this amount of money, $10 billion, being devoted to opioid abatement. And it's only available through this plan, assuming we can get it approved. And I think when people think about it, they will come around to the notion, well, I might have liked something slightly different, but this is certainly a lot better than going into endless, costly litigation that may end up with no proceeds going to anybody.
Okay, no. I might have liked something different, but this is better than nothing. It's what you say when your dad insists on having dinner at Chili's, not when you're talking about the fate of a company that poisoned a generation, which, incidentally, is, I believe, Chili's current slogan. And here is the thing. That man is not even entirely wrong. The longer these lawsuits drag on, the more money will get wasted in court, and an increasingly large percentage of it will go to lawyers rather than victims, because right now, under this settlement, claimants could receive payments from $3,500 to $48,000, which, yes, feels wildly insufficient, but some families are reluctantly willing to take what they can get. Although I will say others, like this woman whose son became addicted to opioids after being prescribed OxyContin as a high school student, are furious that this is what it's come to.
We want our voices heard, not interpreted by the court like they have been. I don't want somebody saying that I'm so happy with the settlement, as I hear at practically every hearing. I'm a mom. I'm not happy with any either in families.
Exactly. For some families of victims, the opportunity to have their voices heard is priceless, which is to say, a fuck of a lot more than $48,000. Some have even called into court only to be told it wasn't the right forum. One woman called into the bankruptcy hearing and said, I lost my brother tragically at the tip of the epidemic in 2012. I would like to speak in memory of my brother. To which the judge replied, I hold hearings on what is scheduled before me. I don't think that this is the proper forum to do this. And the thing is, he is right. But this also may be the last forum these families have to be heard. Look, it might well be true that this is the best deal we can get under our current system, but the fact that that's the case doesn't speak well to this deal, or indeed the system itself. And if you're thinking, well, the Sacklers are paying so much already, what more do you want? I'm not sure that is the right way to think about this, because I would argue that when your family's company recklessly sold a product as damaging as OxyContin, the question might not be, how many billions is it right for you to pay? It's how many billions is it right for you to keep? And I would argue No billions. And I'm afraid it somehow gets one step worse. Because the way this settlement is structured, it's actually hurting the Sacklers even less than you might think. That 4.3 billion that they've agreed to pay is spread out over 9 years, with the largest payments coming toward the end of that period, which means they could make that money up in interest and investments and never have to touch the principal. In fact, when the Sacklers are done paying in 2030, they will probably be richer than they are today. So I guess the answer to we're rich for how long is, oh, don't worry, forever, David, because it seems that's how the fucking system works. Unfortunately, when it comes to accountability,
I think for a lot of the politicians, they don't want to go back to their normal day job.
No.
You know, they're happy operating in crisis mode because it gives them a sense of purpose.
That's one of the hidden secrets of this crisis, that nobody wants to go back, or most people don't want to go back to the old normal. So if we try to wake people up, we should avoid giving them the impression that we want them to go back to the old normal, because they don't want to go back to the bullshit jobs. They don't want to go back to this terrible state of anxiety. We should try to show them and try to show them that there are other ways to change this old normal. That's the most important thing, I think. And indeed, politicians, well, they were losing their grasp on society before the crisis, and now they have a narrative which allows them to give direction to a society again, to be true leaders again. So all these factors together make that it's impossible at this moment to go back to the old normal.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to touch on another piece before we move on. But you know, in the sense of this, you know, I consider myself. You know, I started this show back in October. We've probably done over 300 episodes now. Really, just to start asking the questions that most seemed unwilling to ask. But as a consequence, you know, I've had to suffer all manner of abuse and insults, accusations.
We're going to the Highway 9 Bird Sanctuary. I understand they installed a new bird feeder this year. It's shaped like a park, and it's on this really tall pole. That's right, dead serious about going to Itchy and Scratchy Land. You know,
Major implications from this next story involving what are known as the Pandora Papers. Hundreds of Canadians listed among members of a global elite of rich and famous who are using offshore tax havens. Almost 12 million financial documents were leaked to the Washington, D.C. based International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and shared with Canadian reporters. Among those alleged to be hiding away secret fortunes are 35 current and former world leaders, 330 politicians, more than 130 billionaires, as well as CEOs, celebrities, judges, criminals, and the list goes on. Ben Holman is my guest, senior editor of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Ben, great to have you part of our coverage today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Hey, what are the implications, do you think, the ramifications of this dump of all of these documents?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you mentioned, this is the biggest offshore leak in history. It really sort of lays bare the financial secrets of some of the people who are in a position to actually change the offshore system and particularly crack down on tax shelters. Politicians especially, hundreds of politicians are in our data. We found they have offshore accounts, secret offshore accounts and trusts, along with billionaires, celebrities, and many more. And I think one of the implications really that we expect is that there'll be more heightened focus, not just on these people, not just on these individuals, but on the enablers, on the professional firms and other companies that really help direct this offshore economy.
It raises so many questions about, you know, those in positions of power who are trying to advocate, or so they say, on behalf of transparency and accountability, fight corruption, to then see some of these revelations coming to light.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that that is, we see the Prime Minister of Pakistan, for example, who has previously spoken out against the flow of money from his country into offshore accounts. some of his close associates, we find out, also have offshore accounts. So, I think it's going to raise a lot of questions for these people. We're already seeing reaction from around the world. I think at last count, we have 8 governments promising investigations. And so, we'll see. It's early hours of this investigation.
I know, obviously, in previous releases involving, different financial documents that your group has been involved with. Later there were ramifications and consequences for some of the people involved. They had to pay back taxes. In some cases, investigations were launched into some of their activities, Ben.
Yeah, that's right. I think a lot of people might be familiar with the Panama Papers. That was almost 5 years ago now, a little bit more than 5 years ago now. And billions of dollars were recovered after that investigation. Just by way of comparison, the Panama Papers came from one offshore provider. This one is from 14 different offshore providers. So the scope is much greater. And, analogy I've been using is that, the Panama Papers was like a chapter, and this is closer to a book and what it reveals.
And for people who are trying to make sense of all of this, is what's happening, is it illegal, Ben, or is it just using tax havens that are available?
Yeah, often it is legal. Often what we're seeing are people just taking advantage of countries that intentionally have sort of weak laws and allow people to set up companies without reporting who really owns the company. So you can set up a company in a lot of places with something called a nominee director, which is really a front man. So it's really impossible to figure out who's really benefiting from the company and what it controls. And I should say that, we talk a lot about tax shelters as, these, palm tree islands or whatever. The United States, our reporting shows, is really one of the biggest tax havens in the world, and a growing one at that. We have a story that spotlights South Dakota, which has become a real hub of the international trust industry.
Yeah, well said. Delaware, of course, is another one. I'm curious, sort of as well, bigger picture, how easy or not this sort of thing is to do. Just, for people who have a lot of money and are able to, hire accountants and they know how the system works. Again, sort of the level of complexity here.
Yeah, the answer is that it could not be easier. For a few $100s, a few $1,000s in some cases, you can find a lawyer in Panama or in the British Virgin Islands or in the United States who will direct you to the right place to get your company or trust set up. It's incredibly easy, and because the fact that this all happens in the shadows, there's just not much transparency. So people can do it without much fear that there will be blowback. Of course, the revelations of these documents might challenge some of those assumptions.
It's just a really important example of why investigative journalism is so crucial, and now more than ever. The fact that your international consortium was able to do this, can you just tell us, sort of in layman's terms, how wide-reaching this investigation was, Ben?
Well, we think it's the biggest journalism collaboration in history. And we are a small nonprofit, a few dozen people. But what we really do is leverage the power of our reporting partners all around the world. We work with the Washington Post and the Toronto Star and the BBC and small outlets in Asia and in Africa and in South America, where there might be 1 or 2 people in a newsroom and they have very few resources. But by teaming together, we're able to accomplish something that individually none of us could have done on our own.
Is this going to make a lot of people nervous?
I think it already is making a lot of, yes.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Do police deal with protesters differently depending on what they're protesting about? Well, that question emerged after recent anti-vax demonstrations, so we'll take the measure of it tonight. Then, writer Kamal Al-Somaili talks to Jay and Jagannathan about the immigration road less traveled, returning to one's country of origin. It's Monday, October 4th, and that's ahead on the agenda. Protests against vaccine mandates have led to hostile confrontations at hospitals, restaurants, and shopping malls. So too have the clearing of homeless encampments. Both types of protests mean a police presence. Do they and should they get the same policing approach? We'll hear from three voices tonight. First up, in the provincial capital, in the Chinatown, Kensington neighborhood, there's lawyer Karima Saad, who practices criminal and landlord-tenant law and has been witnessing some of what's gone on firsthand. And Karima, first of all, let's welcome you back to TVO. It's good to see you again. Do I have this right that you have been out there with your video recorder taking pictures of some of the demonstrations over the last few weeks?
That's exactly right. It's been over the past few months, actually.
And how come? Why are you doing it?
It started out of just a curiosity, and my office is proximate to where these protests were happening. And the more I looked into it and observed, the more troubled I was by what I was seeing. And so it became kind of a compulsion to document what I saw happening outside.
Now, these are the anti-vax demonstrations. What did you find problematic about it that you felt you needed to chronicle?
There's a lot of imagery and symbolism that evokes Nazism and references to apartheid, segregation, things that don't really match, in my view, what is happening with public health mandates. And the more I looked into it, there seem to be groups, particularly white nationalist groups, that are using the cover of the pandemic to, let's say, bring new people into their ranks.
So you think they're using the pandemic to pursue a different agenda that has actually not much to do with public health? Do I have that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay, let's take some little look-see here at some pictures that you shot. I guess this is a little over a week ago at the Eaton Centre in downtown Toronto, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would. Okay, to the average observer, Karima, that looks like a bit of a demonstration that is perhaps on the verge of getting a little bit out of hand. What are you seeing there, though, that goes beyond that?
I'm seeing people trying to force their way into the Eaton Centre, and in so doing, there are assaults on security guards, assaults on police, and really just a general recklessness for public health and safety. And this was one of the escalations that I've observed. So over the past few months, it's ranged from yelling at strangers on the street to the occasional physical confrontation. And that escalation is concerning.
Now, you just used the word assault to describe what you saw. That's a legal term. Do you know if, in fact, anybody was charged with assault on that occasion?
There were at least 2 people charged with assault. But if we look closely at the video, I think that there are a few more who could have received charges. And I'm not one to call for heavy-handed police action. But I think that the police response overall to anti-vax demonstrations has emboldened the protesters. And, I'll use the word escalation again, because I think that that's what we're seeing.
Okay, you better follow up on that, because are you suggesting that the police behavior, that the way that they have responded to the anti-vax protests has in fact encouraged them to get more violent?
I think that that's a possibility. I think that there are various factors and variables at play. But if we compare some of the police response to the anti-vax protests versus behavior in other situations, such as encampments, I think that there's a very clear difference, and it's something that needs to be looked at. And even speaking to police officers during these anti-vax protests, it really tended to be a hands-off approach. We respect the right to protest, which is not inherently a problematic thing. Again, the discrepancy in treatment, I think, is something that has emboldened people. And, to follow that up with the fact that there are organizations purporting to represent active and retired police officers in opposition to public health mandates, and the overall tone within the movement coming from personalities in the anti-vax movement is the police are on our side. And there haven't really been any strong